welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us to discuss a very urgent topic, unfortunate topic of the Israel-Hamas war, the reports about intelligence failures and where we go from here, is Dan Diker, who has the oh my gosh, so sorry, 1 second. Having an issue here. 1 second. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, to discuss a very urgent topic, a very terrible, devastating topic of the Israel-Hamas war, the intelligence failures and reports of them surrounding it. And where we go from here is Dan Diker from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a very difficult few days. And yesterday, we saw a New York Times report by Ronan Bergman, which details some of the failures that have led to vulnerabilities that Hamas has exploited. Can you tell us a little about what is going on in Israel in terms of trying to deal with the immediate repercussions of this issue? What action has Israel been taking to patch up these vulnerabilities and to secure itself in light of the ongoing military efforts?
Absolutely. Thank you, Irina, for having me on the program. Israel, as we speak, is burying hundreds of people out of the 1,200 people, mostly civilians, who were massacred, and there's no other word but massacred, by close to 3,000 Hamas terrorists, heavily armed with automatic weaponry. A lot of this weaponry, the strategy, the inspiration, the direction can be found in Tehran. And that's why I would call it the Tehran massacre, as opposed to just calling it the Hamas massacre, because those of us who have been Iran watchers or Iran regime watchers, including yourself for many years, have known that there is a direct connection between the Iranian regime and their very high-level strategy to isolate and destroy the state of Israel, which they have declared since 1979, when Grand Ayatollah Khomeini arrived from France and very quickly announced that Israel is the little Satan, the United States is the great Satan, and they would be targeting the little Satan for destruction. Well, on Saturday, on Shabbat, on Simchat Torah, their promise to destroy the little Satan basically was backed by the actions of their terror proxy, Hamas, who was training with their Iranian regime taskmasters and paymasters for some years to make this happen particularly intensively over the last months. There is a very serious strategic and security collapse in Israel. As Ronan Bergman reported and commented in the New York Times, there was an operational collapse, there was a strategic conceptual collapse, and there was a tactical collapse. And all three of those have been addressed and are being addressed immediately. Obviously, there's going to be some very serious self-reflection, investigation. I'm sure there's going to be a major governmental panel of inquiry into this most severe security. No, there's no other way of putting it, but strategic collapse since the founding of the state. We've never seen anything like this, and it was a combination of a massive cyber attack by the Iranian regime and carried out by Hamas that neutralized the early warning systems on the fence itself, as well as in the cameras in the watchtowers. So they figured out exactly how to neutralize all those early warning systems simultaneously, and it also left the brunt of the responsibility on several sets of eyes, and all of that in a perfect storm was not working correctly, and that allowed the Hamas, I would say, terrorists and fellow travelers, all armed with a lot with automatic weaponry, with hand grenades, machetes were found in scores of jeeps, which is extraordinary. That through the holes in 12 areas of the fence arena, past some 40 or 50 cars, modern, late model cars, jeeps, 4x4, pickup trucks with 8 and 10 heavily armed terrorists in each of these cars. We had somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 terrorists overwhelmed hundreds of troops in the Gaza area, and then they made their way the 20-kilometer trip, which is probably a 20-minute trip, to start massacring entire families in cold blood in some 20 to 25 kibbutzim and communities within a few kilometers, within a number of kilometers of the Gaza Strip. So the army has cleared out Israel of 99% of the terrorists. There are actually, as of today, there were still some Hamas terrorists believed to be in the country, but Israel managed to kill between 1,500-1,600 terrorists that had been in Israel. Our major problem now, as you know, is that there are well over 150 kidnapped victims and captives, both civilian, children, women, elderly, and soldiers, in the hands of these barbarians that are controlling the de facto state of Gaza. Now, it remains to be seen how aggressive the Israeli military counterstrike will be until the army eliminates completely the Hamas threat from every aspect of that threat.
There's a lot to unpack here. Let's start from what you mentioned earlier, which is that Hamas figured out how to overwhelm and disable the technical defenses on the Israel side. Many have compared the situation a little bit to the 1973 war, simply because in the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, Israel over-relied on fixed defenses rather than their own tactic of a very dynamic movement, and they have also overestimated the time it would take for the Egyptians to break through, or underestimated rather. We have seen the U.S. intelligence also underestimate the times it would take for the Taliban to take over in Afghanistan back in the day. And there's been similar timeline-related failures by intelligence assessments in lately. But the technical issue is something interesting to me, because speaking to the experts, they essentially pointed to the fact that the way this could have happened is whether if Hamas had been working with far more sophisticated cybersecurity experts who found a path to disabling, at least temporarily, those defenses in a particular way, or if they alternatively had inside information for when those defenses would have been either overwhelmed by the internal testing, down for maintenance temporarily, or otherwise at a point where they could be exploited. Each possibility is disturbing. If Hamas is working with outside forces, who could they be? Could they be Russians, Chinese, Western mercenaries of some sort who are lending their skills? If, on the other hand, it's an internal issue, if there was a mole who was giving them information, that's even more of a problem, because can that party or parties be detected before they further compromise the security in the course of the ongoing operations?
Clearly, Irina, I think, first of all, we're in the world of speculation right now. We just don't have the information. The information has not been published. I don't even think the information's been gathered and assessed. But there are certain lines of analysis that we can assume in order to create a logical chain of events. One thing we've been looking at is the Iranian regime has compromised the U.S. State Department. They compromised the Pentagon with workers there that had reported to Rob Malley, and they're clearly sensitive information about Israel and Israeli security requirements in various sectors, southern sector included, that may well have been shared and transmitted through those compromised individuals that penetrated the higher levels of the Pentagon and the State Department. So that's one particular area. The other point to remember here is that Israel allowed thousands of Gaza workers to come into Israel to earn a very good wage, actually, compared to what they were earning in Gaza or anywhere else in Palestinian-controlled territories. And those workers that had passes to come into Israel actually became either Hamas assistants, or they were connected to the Hamas in some way, or they were just good at supplying information about the timing of security oversight and the location, the location of bases, the timing that people go in, who's in, around the bases. So you did have that. People coming into Israel on a daily basis, going back into Gaza on a daily basis. And then finally, I think you had an internal conceptual problem, which is that Israel thought it could rely on technology completely. It could reduce the amount of human effort and massive traditional, conventional, massive supervision and patrols, rely on Israel's very, very fine optical technology and audio technology, visual technologies to make its life easier. And also, there was a conceptual problem about Hamas political ideology and the idea that Israel could essentially maintain a economic regime of cash payments to the Hamas leadership, as well as through the Qataris, who were paying, $10-20 million a month in cash, a lot of that going into the pockets of Hamas leadership. But the thinking was that the Hamas leadership was more interested in international legitimacy, in economic stabilization and growth, in building homes, and they took their eye. Israel and the West, but particularly Israel, took their eye off the ball. That the Hamas, as the Palestinian branch of the extreme Muslim Brotherhood, was actually born to destroy Israel and kill the Jews. That was the charter. That's been the charter since 1988 of the Hamas. And it goes back to the 1920s. Actually, it goes back not only to the 1920s and the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood, which carried forward. I'm talking about Hassan al-Banna and ultimately Said Qutb. Remember, the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were very much carrying forward the legacy of Soviet and Nazi conspiracy theories about the Jews and the visceral hatred of Jews. And the commitment to destroy the Jewish state were very much part of Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Of course, the state was refounded in 1948, so that there were several stages. Of development, of ideological and political development of the Muslim Brotherhood. But very clearly, they carried forth Nazi and Soviet ideas, lest anyone think that the Hamas decided to mass murder children and decapitate children, machete entire families who were found hacked to death in the most brutal medieval form of assassination and murder. This is not a question of socioeconomic deprivation that had caused the leadership to lose its mind temporarily and go out and hack to death 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians. But in fact, This was a carefully planned, ideologically driven program for many, many years to murder as many Jews as possible and destroy, cause as much damage to the Jewish state as possible. And Israel, unfortunately, having succumbed to a false conception about where the Hamas leadership is and where the and where many people in Gaza are, they let their guard down, and the results are absolutely tragic.
I have so many questions here, but I'll start with the point that the comparison that you drew with the Soviet and Nazi ideology, because these Soviet methods that have not been fully forgotten. We have seen the similar level of brutality by Russians first in Chechnya, and then, unsurprisingly, many years later in areas that they have since tried to conquer, including Bucha in Ukraine and other areas. Is there anything? We have seen that Hamas has been meeting with Russian officials in Moscow, among other countries. Have the tactics changed as a result of this more international legitimacy among the bad actors, among other regimes that are that pursue anti-Western lines? Besides Iran's obvious track record here, can we assume that this level of deception that has so successfully hoodwinked the Israeli political elites and the military echelons can be attributed to more sophisticated actors and more brutal actors influencing the way it operates?
That's a very good question. We do know, and you know as an expert in what they call in the Russian literature active measure, the Soviet literature active measures, what they're calling in the modern Russian military literature hybrid warfare, which is different than the American military understanding of hybrid warfare. The Russian way of war and the Soviet way of war was through deception, disinformation, malinformation, psychological warfare, even off the classic battlefield and on other battlefields like the economic and political and diplomatic and media battlefields. Here you have a classic case of strategic surprise, which is a Western military idea just a classic case, but very much you have case of deception here also. And the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, founded by Yasser Arafat and continued by Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader, they were very much the students of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese Long War concept. They were students of Soviet active measures. They were the students also of Islamic warfare, as they saw the Iranian regime. Now, the Palestinian leadership, and particularly the Hamas, made a number of visits to Moscow over the last year and a half, as well as to Tehran. They began intensive visits to Tehran, we know, back in 2018, when Qasem Soleimani was still alive for the following 24 months. But in 2018, he hosted the senior Hamas leadership in Tehran. And the message that was passed is that you won't beat the Israelis on the traditional battlefield. You've got to create new battlefields of deception, disinformation, and other forms of Islamic warfare in order to defeat them. And what we noticed, Irina, was within months of that meeting, the campaign called the Great March of Return, which is, it sounds like a Martin Luther King term, right? The Great March. They actually had photographs of Mahatma Gandhi in Gaza, huge posters of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa in the background, while Ismail Haniyeh, the former Prime Minister of Palestinian Authority, when they won in 2006 in the legislative elections, he was lecturing the people of Gaza about the popular victory. Talk about deception. Adopting, the sort of the peace and virtue discourse of these three great leaders of world peace, and yet they were sending boys and girls charging into an electronic fence by the thousands at that time in 2018 to draw the fire of the Israelis and to test them and to figure out a way to create a massive invasion into Israel. That was the beginning of a real change in policy by the Hamas, and it's directly connected to their Palestinian to their Iranian regime paymasters in Tehran. And Israel simply hadn't been paying close enough attention to the distractions that the Iranian regime was foisting on Israel. If you remember, just a few months ago, there were Iranian agents in parts of Judea and Samaria in the West Bank and cities under Palestinian Authority control, like Jenin, like Nablus, and other cities in northern Samaria, where there were Iranian regime agents in those cities, as well as Iranian proxies, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other cells that were already confronting the Palestinian Authority security forces, those that decided to remain. Others ran away, and that's where the Israeli special forces had to come into those Palestinian-controlled cities and fight those Iranian agents and proxies in those cities. So there was this idea about distracting the Israeli army and trying to draw the attention of the Israelis to the West Bank, when in fact they were preparing this major massacre movement in Gaza that we saw play out over the last 3 days.
I will get back to the Iranian angle of this in just a moment, but I wanted to kind of finish the angle of other foreign actors with the interest in this, and namely Russia and China, because in addition to these visits to Moscow, we have seen for decades Hamas accumulating China-made rockets, including just 2 years ago, in 2021, they were used during some of the attacks on Israel, and they were fairly advanced. There's been rumors of Chinese malware being used as part of this operation to down Israeli defenses, and both Russia and China issued statements that essentially legitimized Hamas as a political entity despite these horrific attacks, and they blocked the UN Security Council effort to condemn this attack. Does that mean that Israel will be shifting its policy on these two states going forward, or will it still try to find some sort of a working relationship with them, given the situation?
Well, clearly Israel has tried to maintain a working relationship with the Kremlin, particularly during the year and a half ago or so, when Russia invaded the Ukraine once again after following the Crimea invasion in 2014. And the reason is that from a strategic and military standpoint, the Russians have very strong control over Syrian airspace, and they also have a major base, a major naval base in Tartus, both in the air base in Latakia and
I'd like to push back on that for a second, given that Russia has been, first of all, reluctant to engage in any military operations against Israel because it has significant commercial and other interests in Israel, and second, because quite frankly, over the course of the Ukraine war, it has been weakened substantially and even had to remove the S-300s from there. Is it really fair to say that Russia today is the same Russia it was, its capabilities and threat in terms of military are the same that they were a year and a half ago, and that is the only reason Israel has adopted such an approach? After all, Israel's cooperation with Russia goes well beyond military neutrality. It certainly has reached agreements in spheres of cooperation with its propaganda machinery that promotes the horrific policies in Ukraine, signed off on film cooperation. Is that really so necessary for Israeli security?
I think that it is the relationship's extremely important for Israeli security. It's Russia's involvement to whatever extent in the Hamas arena. And by the way, we saw the Wagner mercenary patches on some of the on some of the outfits of the Hamas terrorists, and that we don't know whether that was just sort of a sport that they put on Hamas patches or Wagner patches, or whether they received those during their trip to the Soviet Union, whether the Wagner group was involved. But it's clear that the Russian involvement was, I think, much more against the United States per se than it was against Israel. Let's remember that Israel houses the largest expat communities of Russians in the world, other than in Russia itself. And so, you know, I've always understood, since visiting Moscow myself back in 2011 and having a long talk with Rabbi Lazar, who's the closest Jewish rabbinical representative to the Kremlin, to Putin himself, that Putin does not have an enmity-driven relationship with Israel, but they have their own interests, which are very strongly anti-American. So that is
once
sort of,
again, Israel is being used as a proxy, just like Stalin once agreed to back the creation of Israel in order to create another socialist paradise in the Middle East. Now Putin is trying to turn Israel into a proxy against the United States by way of infiltration and by way of this sort of political pressure.
That's a good point. It's a good point. It's a discussion worth having to understand how Israel actually and the Palestinian organizations, lahavdil, as they say, many differences between them, are being mobilized and manipulated, if you will, by this sort of great power realignment between the United States, Russia, China, and Iran has to be put into that group as well. So clearly, the point I think you're making, Irina, which is very well taken, is that, you know, what many people think is a small, local, bloody, deathly conflict in a small patch of land called Gaza is really part of a much larger conflict between superpowers that Israel has been swept up into, that is right now being driven by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its race for regional supremacy and ultimately global supremacy according to its own ideology. So, you know, Iran controls many parts of Iraq, controls Syria, controls Lebanon, controls Gaza, and controls much of Yemen. This is exactly where the Iranian regime wants to have everyone. Uri Lubrani, the last Israeli ambassador to Tehran until the revolution I guess the spring of 1979, he used to tell us in his last years that Iran looks at the Middle East as a chessboard, and it moves its different proxy organizations according to the goal of checkmating its adversaries, and all the while keeps itself as the king all the way back in the rear part of the chessboard, mobilizing the other pieces out in the enemy's field.
So this increased distrust between Israel and the US over whether it's Russia, China, or anything else benefits Iran and benefits its goal of encircling Israel, undermining investment into Israel, and otherwise isolating Israel from the Western international community. But coming back to Iran, you have earlier touched on the Biden administration and its employment of some of the actors who had been associated with the Mali investigation and scandal, and some of them still retain very sensitive positions in areas where they have access to classified material, including that related to hostage issues. We're talking about Ariane Tabatabai and the like, who may have kept sensitive intelligence from getting to Israel, and certainly from even getting to the American decision makers regarding this whole situation. Yet, despite all of these factors, this Tabatabai her clearance has not been removed as far as we know, even after this attack has occurred. To this day, she's still there. Mali is still teaching at Princeton and Yale. The administration has tried to distance Iran from these affairs by claiming that they're investigating the multiple, by the way, not just one Wall Street Journal reports, which have pointed to Iran's direct incitement of violence against Israel, and in the case of this operation, approval of this operation in Beirut, which means Hezbollah was fully coordinated on this plan to draw Israel into a long multi-front confrontation. And Germany just came out stating that there is no evidence that Iran is in any way involved in the planning of this attack. Given this conflicting reality of Iran, of Hamas operatives go around thanking Iran and claiming that Iran is essentially even helping them plan future attacks elsewhere. Given that Iran essentially boasted about all of this, it used threats of disruption short days before the attack, of disrupting the expansion of Abraham Accords, but regardless of its intent in that regard, clearly indicated its level of involvement. How can we explain this fixation on continuing with any sort of Iran whitewashing or Iran deal making when this level of brutality upends the entire Biden policy in the region? How can we possibly explain this contradiction, which is absurd on its face? Not even talking about human rights issues concerning Israel now, just talking from a strategic political perspective for the United States. Iran comes in, destroys everything Biden's been trying to do, and yet Biden continues defending it. And what is the hope here?
The hope, the Biden administration's conception is that there is no apparent contradiction. They have seen since the Obama years, the Iranian regime is the solution to the Middle East, not the problem in the Middle East. They saw Al-Qaeda and the extremist Salafi movements as the problem, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates as the problem in the Middle East. And they've stuck to this conception, which Israel has understood to be 180 degrees wrong. And today, because the Iranian Iranian regime way of war is very sophisticated and very hidden. It's really it's almost like the guiding hand, behind all of these other front and center proxies. Then they have a lot of deniability, which the United States has used because in order to buttress its conception that Iran is the key to creating stability and security for the Middle East, and therefore that's why they now will announce that there's no absolute palpable evidence that the Iranians were involved directly in planning, strategizing, financing. I think it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to break that, and show that to be incorrect. As a matter of fact, even before this phone call, I had a discussion. I had a discussion with members of the Iranian opposition that include a former senior official of the regime, and that former official of the regime, who's now an official of the opposition, said there is absolutely no doubt in his mind that this has been the Tehran massacre that was essentially planned, strategized, financed, and inspired by the Iranian regime. The Hamas has never had the capability of pulling off such a perfect 9/11 type of operation like this. It required a much, much larger power and sort of conception of planning. It looks now that the American administrations have thrown billions of dollars at the Iranian regime, which they've obviously used because money is fungible. They use a lot of this to fund their proxies and to fund their race for regional supremacy under a burgeoning nuclear umbrella. And it's very logical for those who follow the Iranian regime, where they're at 66% uranium enrichment, and the race is to 90% so they can produce one or a number of nuclear bombs. At the same time, they're facing a lot of internal opposition. They have a terrible economy. They have tremendous domestic difficulties. So the combination of wanting to reach either complete very important phase in their ballistic missile development, in their uranium enrichment development, in their soft water development, in their soft water plants, as well as, you know, the overall race to the bomb, to be a nuclear breakout state, required that they mobilize these chess pieces in order to focus international attention, which is now focused on Gaza and will be focused on Gaza for a few months. It's exactly what they want in order for them to, you know, shut down their own cameras and race towards their, you know, their goal of nuclear supremacy in the Middle East. And once they're a nuclear breakout state, the whole world changes once again. And I think they believe that having Hamas undertake this massacre and getting Israel involved with burying 1,200 people and investigating its own failures, and then possibly having to engage in a two-front war, both in the north opposite Iranian proxy Hezbollah and other proxies, as well as against Hamas, would actually prevent the Israeli defense forces from attacking Tehran. So this has been, we can see it as a very, very carefully considered decision as to how they mobilized this massacre, and very skillfully, and fits right in within the Iranian regime playbook.
Do you think this continuing Biden administration fixation on covering for Iranian spies, saboteurs, and terrorists going to affect security relations on a deeper level between Israel and the U.S., given that the U.S. could be considered essentially compromised by these Iranian actors?
It's true. I think it's clear, Erin, I think you know as a security analyst also, that the American-Israeli national security defense military relationship is really airtight. And in many times during the hills and valleys of Israeli-American political discussions and the ups and downs in those discussions, and there have been a lot of ups and downs, you know, since the Obama administration. Then there was an up during the Trump administration. There was an I think they saw Iran policy eye to eye, and now they're valley. There's another valley in the political relationship, but the military relationship has always been consistent and strong between the two countries, and the level of, I think, preparedness, intelligence sharing, strategic cooperation is very, very, very high at this point. And you see that, you know, we see that with the movement of the USS Ford aircraft carrier, which is essentially a high-rise building horizontally mobilized in the Mediterranean Sea with massive aircraft capabilities. We see that this cooperation very, very strongly right now.
Well, that's an overt deterrence move to prevent Hezbollah from escalating and so forth. But we are talking about downright intelligence level cooperation. Pentagon has been making some very bizarre moves lately, such as inviting the Princeton Professor Mousavian to give intelligence briefing, essentially defending, relying on people like Mousavian, a former Iranian operative and supposedly diplomat. And now this Tabatabai character has access to classified information. Given that there are obviously untrustworthy individuals in positions of influence, how can that not affect that level of relationship? Not the political signs of, you know, positive, you know, support that we are seeing overtly, such as these moves, which are ultimately political decisions, but these day-to-day information handling details that can impact security and the flow of information to bad actors, including about Israel's security, and which you suggested earlier on did. How could that not be disruptive?
Well, clearly now I think there's going to be a review of the type of information security policy and what is shared and what's not shared and how it's shared and with whom it's shared, when it's shared, because there is clearly an information intelligence distribution breakdown in what happened here. You know, on Saturday, there's just, it's simply the magnitude of the disaster from a military, national security, intelligence point of view is so profound that it's going to require a ground up re-engineering, realignment of all of these, what we call security, military security, political relationship between us, I think between us and the United States and us and all of our allies. Because it's clear that something happened. There's an information security breakdown of the highest order, not only intelligence.
And speaking of political relationships, there has been another development which we have previously addressed in our other discussions, which is Saudi Arabia's withdrawal from the alleged normalization negotiations, none of which mysteriously included Israel directly, and which I was very skeptical about to begin with. The way the Saudi Arabia reacted was very interesting, because it was almost as if they were looking for an opportunity to exit, and this operation provided them. Their language went farther than any of the other Arab states and international community members calling for de-escalation and so forth. It aligned precisely with Iran and Qatar in blaming this entire mess on Israel, blaming the victim for a horrific terrorist attack. And obviously there was, and then followed immediately by withdrawal from the negotiations, which were only proceeding with the United States anyway, and supposedly address Saudi's own interest in a defense deal, in civilian nuclear program, and so forth. Given all these circumstances that have allowed Riyadh to make that clean getaway at this particular point in time, what can we say about this whole plan to try to, on the one hand, the administration encouraging Iran to normalize with these Arab states, on the other hand, thinking it's possible to have that and also have any sort of Abraham Accord expansion and normalization with Israel and Saudi Arabia?
You're right. That's actually a very good runway into another question, which is, look at the diplomatic re-engagement that just took place some few months ago between Saudi and the Iranian regime and Syria and the Arab League that the Saudis hosted in Jeddah. And at the same time, the new and close diplomatic partner of the Saudis are those responsible for actually breaking up one of the most important relationships that the Saudis had determined for itself and its Gulf partners. So if that isn't a deceptive, destructive, contradictory relationship in and of itself, I don't know what is. And I think that example reflects the reality of the Middle East, where nothing is a surprise and everything is a surprise. And here the behavior of the Iranian regime, even in re-engaging the Saudis and then in sort of working against the wishes of its new diplomatic partner, and really trying to, in a sense, giving a bear hug, if you will, a bloody bear hug to its Saudi partner by attacking Israel in this way, is a great example of the internal contradictions in the relationships in the Middle East. It's possible to be both an enemy, an adversary, and an advocate and an ally in the Middle East. It's not necessarily certainly within the Arab network. It's not necessarily considered such a contradiction, even though in Western terms it's a contradiction, and that's why the West has gotten the Arab East wrong for the last 100 years.
I'd like to draw an attention to one fact that came out recently that seems to explain this contradiction. And actually, if for those of us who had been watching this closely, none of this came to a surprise. The foreign relations sphere focus seems to be on current events rather than history. History of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East shows that there always has been a streak of particular political factions who had been open to a working relationship with Iran at various points in time, even at the peak of its nuclear ambitions, even preceding the Islamic Revolution, and certainly even after. And one thing that came out that was interesting in this whole scandal about the Americans who had been the American agents of influence for Iran is that we have seen Tabatabai engage with her Iranian handler concerning who events she was invited to, and he essentially told her not to go to the Israeli conference, Israeli events, but gave her permission to engage with Saudi Arabia, specifically Turkey Al Faisal, who is who, as we know, was the backer of Jamal Khashoggi. He sent Khashoggi to negotiate with Osama bin Laden. He has a long history of aligning with very traditional old guard factions of the royal family and so on and so forth. And this is back in 2014, long before MBS, long before all of these things. Iran clearly saw Turkey Al Faisal and whoever was around him in 2014 as potential working partners in Saudi Arabia, and they did not launch their attack on Saudi embassy until 2016, when MBS was coming into the picture, and he was kind of being disruptive to these kind of long relations. So now that we're seeing kind of some of this, there's been kind of a double speak on Saudi part, but the one thing that remains constant is that Iran clearly saw a potential there for a very long time. It has been very much seeing that the old guard factions are potential partners, the reformists not so much, but as we're seeing with the reformists playing increasingly less of a role in foreign policy, Iran seems to be taking full advantage of that, and that is something that could have been predicted had we looked at Iran's attitude towards Saudis years ago, at the time, at the peak of Obama and JCPOA negotiations. Clearly, this relationship has been ongoing. It had its ebbs and flows, but there was a constancy that could have, the Iran's engagement with certain actors in Saudi Arabia. We could have seen it coming. We could have seen how it would end. This is not the general tribal vacillation of Arab states. There is an openness of some actors to working with Iran, while others are significantly less inclined to do so. So how did everyone overlook these internal dynamics? How did people not see that Iran had an opening there with certain factions? How did we assume that Saudi Arabia is a monolith with identical opinions and essentially a complete control by one person, rather than the reality of very different interests and an internal struggle for power?
Well, it's true. I think both both the Saudis and the Iranians have multiple, you have multiple centers of power, but I think that the Iranians are really driven in their security and foreign policy by the IRGC, and the IRGC really makes the vast majority of decisions, and they are as domestically tricky and deceptive as they are in terms of their foreign policy. So I think they keep everybody guessing all the time, and I think they're guessing all the time to see when they're going to break out, when they're going to swarm, where their best opportunity is. They're seriously, I would call them terrorist opportunists, and have so many opportunities to mobilize at the flip of a coin what they want to do, and they set up a lot of different situations. You can see it in Syria, you can see it in Lebanon, you can see it in Gaza. So they just decide which red switch to pull according to the circumstances of the moment, and the circumstances are their best guess and assessment of where their new.
You cut out. Sorry, I couldn't hear your last comment.
Yeah, I couldn't hear I was going to call. I'm going to have to very quick soon say goodbye.
Sure. Yeah. One last question. Given all these realities, given that the international community keeps missing clear signs of danger, of threat, of deception, and of Middle Eastern and mentalities, different cultural attitudes, and how they color intelligence, military, we're in for a very complicated next few years. But Israeli leadership has committed to changing the Middle East with this operation in Gaza. Can they really do that if they do not go after the backers and funders? Iran, Qatar, Turkey all have contributed to this operation in various ways, and they are harboring some of the Hamas heads, let's not forget, and they're financing the continuous recruitment of terrorists, wiping out a few thousand fighters and some infrastructure. Is that really going to change the Middle East without the more strategic goals being accomplished, which cannot be accomplished without US buy-in, really?
Clearly, the problem now is that Israel has suffered a strategic blow to its deterrence. And before it can do anything else, engage in any other relationship, even domestically, politically, foreign policy, security policy, and its major enemy, which is the Iranian regime, is going to have to do a 180-degree switch to restore its deterrence. One of the ways it does that is by showing absolute, overwhelming, massive force in this Gaza theater. And until that happens, and until there is a complete decapitation of all of the Hamas leadership and a collapse of the mid-level Hamas military command, and a very strong message, not only to the Gaza public, but to the leaderships and publics across the Middle East, Israel will not be able to take any other major strategic moves, because it has to signal that it really is the best, strongest, and wisest army, most skilled army in the Middle East region. And right now that has been seriously compromised. So it has an enormous amount of work to do in its own home and its own neighborhood before making any major strategic moves.
Thank you so much for this insightful conversation in light of the crisis we're dealing with. We'll be in touch because the situation is likely to be quite dynamic over the next coming months. Hopefully, the outcome will indeed change things, but for the much better, and will come out stronger as a result. And I wish you all the best. And to everyone watching the Washington Outsider Report, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. as usual.
Thank you very much, Irina. Enjoyed the show.